Good morning and welcome to our continued study in this sermon series Shift. This is the last of this series, and we will be moving on to another series next Sunday, where we will be looking and traveling towards the cross through the season of Lent. I keep forgetting to introduce myself to people that might not know me that see these videos. I am Paul Greer. I'm the worship coordinator here at Main Street United Methodist Church. As we continue this series of lessons on shifting directions and changing things, we turn to the Gospel of the Gospel of Matthew. Mark was last week. Matthew's the 17th chapter, the first 8 verses. This event that is recorded in Matthew 17 occurs after another event where Jesus has asked the disciples as they're walking on the road, first, who do the people say that I am? And then he asks, who do you say that I am? And that's the pertinent question that he was setting this up for, is to find out who the disciples think and understand he is after this time of ministry. You see, at this time, Jesus has understood that he needs to go to Jerusalem, that he's going to die in Jerusalem, and he needs to know that what he's been about with his disciples, that they're starting to understand and comprehend what this is all about. And so after that experience on the road, we come to the scripture today where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up onto the mountain with him for a time of prayer, as Jesus continues to seek not only to know that they know, but to make sure that he has understood God's will in his life correctly. So they go up on the mountain. It's pretty well assumed that this is Mount Hermon. It is a little over 9,000 foot mountain in Israel. And William Barclay, in his commentary, thinks that they did not go all the way to the summit. His reasoning for that is that at 9,000 plus feet in altitude, the air would start to impair their activities. I can attest to that. Last summer we were in Colorado for a week in Colorado Springs, which is 6,000 feet. And even that is somewhat strenuous. But when we went up higher in the mountains, especially up on top of Pikes Peak at 14,000, you really realize the lack of oxygen in the air as you exert yourself. I'm not so sure that Barclay's got that right about Jesus and the disciples not going to the summit. But be that as it may, they were on Mount Hermon, either at the summit or in one of the meadows that, and as the mountain slopes away, that were up there. And they went to have this time of prayer. And as they begin to pray, as Jesus begins to pray, there's this vision of Moses and Elijah that appear. Now, it's important to understand, I think, that this vision did not just come to Jesus. While there's this understanding that Jesus went up there for his own understanding, he took 3 of his disciples, 3 that seemed to have the most understanding, with him. And they also saw this vision of Moses and Elijah there on the mountain talking with Jesus. These 2 individuals are significant, and I'm going to share what William Barclay shared rather than try to summarize this and get some of it wrong. Barclay writes, in Jewish thought, these 2 figures, Moses and Elijah, always stood for certain things. Moses was the greatest of all the lawgivers. He was supremely and uniquely the man who brought God's law to men. Elijah was the greatest of all the prophets. In him, the voice of God spoke to men with unique directness. These two men were the twin peaks of Israel's religious history and achievement. It is as if the greatest figures in Israel's history came to Jesus as he was setting out on the last and greatest adventure into the unknown and told him to go on. In them, all history rose up and pointed Jesus on his way. In them, all history recognized Jesus as its own consummation. The greatest of the lawgivers and the greatest of the prophets recognized Jesus as the one of whom they had dreamed, as the one who they had foretold. Their appearance was the signal for Jesus to go on. So then, the greatest human figures witnessed to Jesus that he was on the right way and bade him to go out on his adventurous exodus to Jerusalem and to Calvary. There's also a sense here I get as I contemplate this and think about it of this new covenant that the prophet Isaiah writes about, that God's going to do a new thing, that the old's going to pass away and there will be this new thing. Well, with Moses and Elijah here, you have this testimony and this passing of the torch, so to speak, from the old into the new that Jesus is bringing about here. And then, as this is taking place, there's a cloud that rolled onto the top of the mountain and completely enveloped them. Jenny and I had an experience some years ago. We were down in the Smoky Mountains, and we had gone up to Klingman's Dome, or we were attempting, I should say, to go to Klingman's Dome, to the lookout post, the observation tower that is up there. As we pulled into the parking lot, there was a cloud that had been blown along and had hit the other side of the mountain from where we were at. And that cloud just kind of rolled over. You could see it as we were getting out of the truck, that the cloud just kind of rolled over. And as it rolled down into that area, it just completely enveloped everybody and everything that was there. It was kind of eerie and it's kind of spooky. You couldn't see, but you could hear. And that was the spooky thing. There were people that were half a mile away on the trail up to and from the observation tower up there. You could hear them talking as they were journeying up and down the mountain there. You couldn't see them, but you knew they were there because you could hear them. And that was just kind of spooky. Well, out of this, if you can imagine being in that kind of environment, not being able to see, and then hearing the voice of God that is speaking to Jesus. Now, here again, this is not something that only Jesus heard. It's something that Peter, James, and John, who were there with him, they also heard that, they experienced that with Jesus there. And then Peter says, this is so good, this is such a wonderful experience. Let us stay here. Let me build 3 tents. That is 3 shelters, so that we can stay here. Now, somebody, when he says 3 there, somebody's going to be left out. And I hadn't thought about that until I was just saying these words here. It should have been 4, because with Jesus with them, there were 4 of them up there. Peter didn't want to come back down. I participated in a spiritual renewal program called Walk to Emmaus for a number of years. This program of the Upper Room that's sponsored and happens around the country. It's a event where you remove yourself from society for 3 days and become a cloistered community where you experience God's love. And frequently, the people that would come and experience this, they didn't want to go back home. They wanted to stay there in the warmth, in that presence, because for many of them, they were experiencing God in a way that they had never experienced Him before in that love. Um, but it's important to also remember when you experience something like this is that Jesus ministered in and among the people. He did not separate himself out and just go and have this warm, as one of our salesmen used to say, this warm, fuzzy time when everybody is feeling good about the situation. He didn't go and do that with his disciples. He stayed in and among the people with his disciples, ministering to them. And that's where we're called to go also, not to stay on the mountaintops as we experience it from time to time. And then as they're going down the mountain, Jesus tells his disciples that don't tell anybody what they've experienced, which seems kind of strange. In Mark's gospel, there is this overriding secretive narrative where Jesus is always telling people, don't say anything about this. Don't tell anybody what you've experienced. And that's carried over here. And I think there are two reasons for this. Not everyone will understand what you've experienced. They weren't there with you. They don't know all of the circumstances. And so some things that you experience in the spiritual nature, not everybody's going to understand that. And then the other thing is that some things are just for you. This event on the mountaintop was primarily for Jesus so that he could understand that his understanding of God's will in his life was correct, and that he needed to continue on to Jerusalem, and whatever came of that, that was God's will, and that his part was to obey in that. I want to close this time this morning by going back and reading this passage, and I want you to just listen to the words. If you need to close your eyes to close things out, or whatever, just to hear and place yourself with Peter, James, and John as they go up the mountain with Jesus and as they experience this, so that you can experience it with them. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brought them to the top of the very high mountain. He was transformed in front of them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all this by saying to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you want, I'll make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." That answers my question there. While he was still speaking, look, a bright cloud overshadowed them. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. I am very pleased with him. Listen to him." Hearing this, the disciples fell on their faces, filled with awe. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anybody about the vision until the human one is raised from the dead." Did you, as you were listening to those words, were there any sounds that you heard or that you thought that you would hear as you were walking along with Jesus there, as you were experiencing that? I think on the mountain there, with the cloud coming over, that you wouldn't have heard anything. It would have been this complete silence, not even hearing the wind as you're enveloped into that cloud, until you heard the voice of God. How do you think you would hear God's voice in that situation? What would it sound like?
I've not imagined that.
Pardon me?
I've not imagined that.
It would have to sound clear so you could understand what he was saying.
Clear. There's an actor, I can't recall his name. He did a number of commercials for State Farm with his deep, resonant bass voice. That's the voice that I hear when I think about it. Would you have been like Peter and wanted to stay there on the mountain? Or would you have been ready to hightail it back home and get out of this environment?
With all of that happening, that would have been frightening, right?
It wouldn't, I would think so.
Yeah. Seeing people that were long dead.
But hearing the voice of God, I think I'd have wanted to stay.
Hmm. As we go through life, as we open ourselves to the Holy Spirit, we experience things along the way. Sometimes we realize that we've experienced it. Other times, we're completely oblivious to what has transpired, and maybe at some later time we'll realize it. But I think that in our life of faith, that voice of God is there for us in times when we need it. It may not be like the guy in the State Farm commercial. It may be like it was for Elijah, in that still, small, quiet voice that in the midst of the earthquakes and the wind and the thunder and the lightning, Elijah heard that voice of God as a still, small voice there. And if we're not still and if we're not quiet, how are we going to hear it? Something to think about. As I said, next week we will start a new series as we journey through the season of Lent. And I hope that you will join us later on this morning and worship here at Main Street as Pastor Dawn takes this passage and unpacks it for us in our lives and explores more what that means to be a disciple of Christ, walking with Christ. May God's blessings be upon you this week.